In the annals of 20th century European history, few figures remain as controversial and paradoxical as Francisco Franco. For nearly 4 decades, this seemingly unremarkable military officer transformed from a colonial war hero into Spain's absolute ruler, presiding over one of Europe's longest-lasting dictatorships. His story is one of ambition, brutality, calculated survival, and ultimately an unexpected transition that would reshape Spain's future. Franco's Spain was a land of contradictions. It was a regime born in blood and maintained through fear, yet it also presided over unprecedented economic prosperity. It was a dictatorship that brutally suppressed opposition, yet gradually liberalized over time. It was led by a man who allied with Hitler and Mussolini, yet skillfully avoided the catastrophe of World War II. And most remarkably, it was an authoritarian system that, unlike so many others, managed a peaceful transition to democracy after its founder's death. Today, nearly 50 years after Franco's death, Spain remains deeply divided over his legacy. For some, he was the savior who rescued Spain from communist chaos and brought stability and prosperity. For others, he was a brutal dictator whose regime murdered thousands, stole children from their families, and suppressed an entire nation's freedom for nearly 4 decades. The truth, as always, is more complex than either narrative suggests. Francisco Franco was neither the heroic savior his supporters claimed, nor simply the fascist monster his detractors portrayed. He was a product of Spain's turbulent early 20th century, a man shaped by colonial warfare, elevated by civil war, and defined by an unwavering commitment to maintaining power at any cost. This is his story, the story of the enigmatic Caudillo who dominated Spain for a generation. Francisco Paulino Hermenegildo Teodulo Franco Bahamonde was born on December 4, 1892, in the coastal naval city of El Ferrol, located in Spain's northwestern region of Galicia. The city itself was defined by its relationship with the Spanish Navy. Its natural harbor had made it one of Spain's principal naval bases since the 18th century. The rhythms of naval life, the hierarchies of military service, and the pride of maritime tradition surrounded young Francisco from birth. His family embodied this naval heritage. For 6 generations, stretching back into the early 18th century, the Francos had served Spain's maritime forces. Originally from Andalusia in southern Spain, the family had established itself in Galicia as part of Spain's naval aristocracy. Francisco's father, Nicolás Franco Salgado Araujo, continued this proud tradition as an officer in the Spanish Naval Administrators Corps during the late 19th century. But Nicolás Franco was an unusual naval officer. Where tradition demanded discipline and respectability, Nicolás displayed bohemian tendencies. He loved gambling, drinking, and the company of women other than his wife. He was frequently absent from the family home, pursuing pleasures in El Ferrol's taverns and brothels. His behavior scandalized conservative Galician society and created deep tensions within his household. Francisco's mother, María del Pilar Bahamonde y Pardo de Andrade, could not have been more different. She came from a well-established Galician family with pretensions to minor nobility and solid upper-middle-class credentials. Deeply religious, she attended Mass daily and ensured her children received proper Catholic instruction. Where Nicolás was chaotic and self-indulgent, María del Pilar was ordered and self-sacrificing. She managed the household with firm discipline, maintained outward respectability despite her husband's behavior, and embodied the conservative Catholic values that defined respectable Spanish society. Young Francisco gravitated instinctively toward his mother. He absorbed her piety, her discipline, her serious demeanor. In many ways, his entire life would be an attempt to embody his mother's values while rejecting everything his father represented. The contrast between his parents would shape Franco's worldview profoundly. He would come to see life as a battle between order and chaos, discipline and decadence, tradition and dissolution. Francisco was described as a small, quiet child, unusually serious for his age. He was not particularly athletic, charismatic, or outgoing. His voice remained high-pitched even into adulthood, earning him the childhood nickname Cerilito, or Little Matchstick, due to his thin frame and squeaky voice. Other children sometimes mocked him, but Francisco learned early to endure mockery with stoic silence. He developed an inward-looking personality, observing rather than participating, calculating rather than acting impulsively, controlling his emotions rather than expressing them freely. He had 3 siblings who would take remarkably different paths in life. His older brother Nicolas would follow their father into the Navy and later serve in Francisco's regime. His younger brother Ramon would become a pioneering aviator, a romantic adventurer, and ironically, a supporter of the Republic. He would die in a plane crash in 1938 during the Civil War. His sister Pilar would remain largely in the background, though she would later write memoirs defending her brother's legacy. The family rupture that would define Francisco's adolescence came in 1907 when he was just 15 years old. Nicolas Franco, who had been maintaining a double life for some time, finally abandoned his family entirely. He left El Ferrol for Madrid, where he openly lived with another woman. He made no pretense of reconciliation, no attempt to maintain even the appearance of family unity. For young Francisco, this abandonment was a wound that never healed. He never forgave his father. Even decades later, when Franco had become Spain's supreme leader, when a word from him could make or break careers, when he held the power of life and death over millions, his relationship with his father remained cold and minimal. They maintained only the most formal contact. Francisco's resentment was profound and permanent. This betrayal reinforced every lesson his mother had taught him about the importance of duty, the necessity of self-control, and the dangers of self-indulgence. It confirmed his emerging worldview: discipline triumphs over chaos, tradition over innovation, order over freedom. In 1907, the same year his father abandoned the family, Francisco made a decision that would alter his destiny. Rather than following 6 generations of family tradition into the Spanish Navy, he enrolled in the Infantry Academy at Toledo. This choice was both rebellion and pragmatism. Rebellion against his father's path. Pragmatism because Spain's navy had been devastated in the Spanish-American War of 1898 and offered limited prospects for ambitious young officers. The Spanish-American War had been a catastrophe that traumatized the nation. In a matter of months during 1898, Spain lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, the last substantial remnants of its once vast global empire. The Spanish Navy was essentially destroyed in lopsided battles at Manila Bay and Santiago de Cuba. Spanish ships, outdated and poorly maintained, proved no match for modern American vessels. The defeat was not just military but psychological. It forced Spain to confront its decline from superpower to second-rate nation. To understand Franco's career, one must understand the Spain he served, a nation wrestling with centuries of decline and searching desperately for a path forward. In the 16th century, Spain had been the dominant global power. Under Charles V and Philip II, Spanish armies were feared throughout Europe. Spanish fleets controlled the Atlantic. Gold and silver from Mexico and Peru filled Spanish treasuries. The phrase "the empire on which the sun never sets" was coined to describe Spanish domains stretching from the Americas to the Philippines. But decline set in during the 17th century. The gold and silver flows from the Americas diminished. Spain's economy, rather than developing manufacturing and commerce, had become dependent on precious metal imports. When these declined, economic crisis followed. Military defeats mounted, to France, to England, to the Dutch. By the 18th century, Spain was clearly a second-tier power, its economy backward, its politics sclerotic, its military weak. The 19th century brought further humiliation and chaos. Napoleon's invasion of Spain from 1808 to 1814 devastated the country and sparked independence movements throughout Spanish America. By 1825, Spain had lost virtually all its American colonies except Cuba and Puerto Rico. The loss of this empire was economically devastating, but also psychologically traumatic for Spanish elites who defined national identity through imperial greatness, even worse than foreign. Defeats were internal divisions. Throughout the 19th century, Spain was racked by civil wars that killed hundreds of thousands. The Carlist Wars, fought in 1833, 1840, 1846, 1849, and 1870 to 1876, pitted liberals against traditionalists, those who wanted to modernize Spain against those who clung to monarchy, aristocracy, and church power. These conflicts created deep fissures in Spanish society that persisted into Franco's era and would ultimately explode in the catastrophic Civil War. 1936-1939, by 1910, when Franco graduated from the infantry academy, Spain was struggling to maintain relevance as a European power. Its economy remained predominantly agricultural, with industrialization barely touching most regions. Illiteracy rates exceeded 50% in many provinces. Infrastructure was primitive compared to France, Germany, or Britain. Political instability was chronic. Governments rose and fell with bewildering frequency, unable to address the country's fundamental problems. The Infantry Academy at Toledo, where Franco spent his formative years from 1907 to 1910, was steeped in the traditions of Spain's imperial past. Located in the historic city of Toledo, once the capital of Imperial Spain, the academy trained officers not just in military tactics but in a particular worldview. They learned that the army was the guardian of Spanish unity against regional separatism. They learned that military values, hierarchy, discipline, obedience, were superior to civilian politics with its chaos and corruption. They learned that Spain's decline could be reversed through strong leadership and national renewal. At 14, Franco was among the Academy's youngest cadets. The environment was harsh and demanding. Discipline was strict, often brutal by modern standards. Hazing of younger cadets was endemic and often vicious. Physical hardship was considered character building. Cadets who showed weakness, physical or emotional, were mercilessly targeted. Franco's small stature and high voice made him a natural target for bullying. Other cadets mocked Cirilito and his squeaky voice. But Franco responded not with rebellion, but with intense dedication to meeting and exceeding every demand. He learned to endure mockery with stoic silence. He focused obsessively on his duties. This experience taught him invaluable lessons about the importance of emotional control and the necessity of projecting strength even when feeling vulnerable. When he graduated in 1910 as a second lieutenant, his academic performance was unremarkable. He finished 251st out of 312 cadets in his class. This modest showing can be partly attributed to his youth and partly to the fact that Franco was not particularly intellectual or scholarly. His strengths lay elsewhere, in practical leadership, organizational ability, physical courage, and an intuitive grasp of military tactics. These qualities would soon become evident in the crucible of colonial warfare. Franco volunteered for service in Spanish Morocco in 1912 at age 19. This decision would define his career and shape the rest of his life. Morocco was where promising officers went to make their reputations, or where they went to die. Spain's involvement in Morocco represented both practical, strategic interest and psychological compensation for lost empire. If Spain could no longer be a global power, it could at least be a regional one. In 1912, through treaty with France, Spain acquired the mountainous northern coast of Morocco, the Rif region, plus a southern strip of territory. France took the larger, more economically valuable central regions, but acquiring territory on paper was vastly different from controlling it in reality. The Berber tribes of the Rif Mountains had warrior traditions stretching back centuries. They had resisted Arab conquest, Ottoman expansion, and now European colonization. The terrain, steep mountains, narrow valleys, limited roads, favored guerrilla warfare. Spanish forces would discover that pacifying this region would be far more difficult and costly than Madrid's politicians had anticipated. The posting to Morocco was dangerous. Many officers avoided it, preferring comfortable garrison duty in Spanish cities. Casualties were high. Diseases like typhoid and dysentery killed as many soldiers as combat. The summer heat was brutal, the winter cold penetrating. Supply lines were unreliable. Medical care was primitive, but Morocco offered something crucial for ambitious young officers: rapid advancement. The Spanish military promoted by merit in colonial warfare in ways it never did in peacetime service at home. Combat experience, bravery under fire, and tactical success could accelerate a career dramatically. An officer who might wait 15 years for promotion in Spain could achieve the same advancement in 3 years in Morocco if he survived. Franco proved more than willing to take these risks. From his first weeks in Morocco, he distinguished himself. He volunteered for dangerous patrols. He led from the front rather than directing from the rear. He demonstrated remarkable physical courage, seemingly indifferent to danger. Bullets that killed men standing next to him left Franco untouched. His soldiers began to believe he was protected by divine providence or supernatural luck. But Franco was more than just brave. He revealed genuine tactical talent, an intuitive sense for terrain, for anticipating enemy movements, for positioning his forces for maximum advantage. He understood the importance of intelligence gathering, of cultivating local informants, of understanding tribal politics. These skills exceeded those of many more senior officers. Perhaps most importantly for his future career, Franco demonstrated concern for his soldiers' welfare that was unusual among Spanish officers of his era. He ensured his men were properly supplied. He checked that their rations were adequate. He visited the wounded in field hospitals. He learned soldiers' names and remembered details about their families. This concern built intense personal loyalty among those who served under him, loyalty that would prove crucial during the Civil War. Franco's rise through the ranks was meteoric. By 1913, just a year into Moroccan service, he earned promotion to first lieutenant in the Regulares Indigenous, elite cavalry units composed of indigenous Moroccan troops under Spanish officers. These units were considered some of Spain's most effective military forces, combining European leadership with the combat skills and local knowledge of Moroccan soldiers. In 1915, at merely 23 years old, Franco became Spain's youngest captain. This promotion was extraordinary, reflecting both his exceptional performance and the high casualty rates among Spanish officers in Morocco. The Spanish press began taking notice. Stories appeared about the young officer from Galicia who seemed to bear a charmed life amid constant danger. But in June 1916, Franco's luck ran out. During an assault on rebel positions near El Biuts, a bullet tore through his lower abdomen, entering near his liver. Franco collapsed, blood pouring from the entry and exit wounds. His men carried him to a field hospital, where military doctors examined the wound and grimly concluded he had little chance of survival. Abdominal wounds typically cause death from blood loss, infection, or damage to vital organs. The doctors did what they could but expected Franco to die. Against all odds, Franco survived. The bullet had somehow missed his major organs and blood vessels by millimeters, a matter of luck, or, as Franco would later suggest, divine intervention. His recovery took months of painful convalescence, first in military hospitals in Ceuta and later in Spain. The wound left a permanent scar that Franco apparently bore with pride as a badge of his military service and his survival of what should have been a mortal wound. During his lengthy recovery back in Spain, Franco received the military's highest decoration for valor and was promoted to major, an almost unprecedented honor for an officer his age. More importantly, he was reassigned to duties in mainland Spain, far from the fighting. This might have ended his meteoric career, as officers who left combat zones often found themselves stuck in dead-end administrative assignments while others earned glory in Morocco. Franco spent the years from 1916 to 1920 in various posts in Spain. During this period, he met Maria del Carmen Polo y Martínez Valdés at a festival in Oviedo in 1917. Carmen came from a prosperous family with commercial interests in Asturias. She was well educated by the standards of the time, conventionally attractive and, crucially, shared Franco's conservative Catholic values and monarchist political views. Their courtship faced initial obstacles. Carmen's family had reservations about Franco. He was a junior officer of modest financial means with uncertain prospects. The serious wound that had sent him back to Spain raised questions about whether he could continue his military career effectively. Additionally, the social gulf between Carmen's wealthy commercial family and Franco's more modest background created some tension. However, Franco's persistence, combined with his growing fame as a war hero, eventually overcame these objections. By the early 1920s, as Franco's career resumed its upward trajectory and his reputation grew, Carmen's family consented to the match. They married on October 22, 1923, in a well-publicized ceremony in Oviedo that drew significant press attention. Franco was by then a national figure, and the wedding was presented as a romantic union between a war hero and a respectable young woman from a good family. King Alfonso III himself sent a personal telegram of congratulations. Their marriage would produce one child, a daughter named Maria del Carmen Franco y Polo, born on September 14, 1926. The fact that they had only one child, and that this child was a daughter rather than a son, would have significant implications for the succession question decades later when Franco ruled Spain. Franco apparently desired a son to carry on his name and military legacy, but it was not to be. Their daughter would live a largely private life, though she would later defend her father's reputation fiercely against critics. Franco's return to Morocco in 1920 coincided with a pivotal development in Spanish military organization, the creation of the Spanish Foreign Legion, or Tercio de Extranjeros. This new military unit was explicitly modeled on France's famed Légion étrangère and was intended to become Spain's premier shock force in colonial warfare. The Legion's founding commander was Colonel José Millán Astray, one of the most colorful and controversial figures in Spanish military history. Millán Astray was a charismatic eccentric who had lost an arm and an eye in previous combat operations. He was brilliant but emotionally unstable, inspiring but brutal, visionary but often unhinged. He created the Legion's distinctive mystique through its motto, Viva la Muerte, long live death, and its code emphasizing aggression, fearlessness, and a romanticized view of death in battle as the highest honor. Franco was appointed second in command of this newly established force at just 27 years old. This appointment reflected both his growing reputation and the Legion's need for officers who combined administrative ability with extensive combat experience. Franco was given responsibility for training, organizing, and leading what was intended to become Spain's most elite military unit. The timing proved fortuitous. A new and far more serious conflict was about to erupt, the Rif War, which would rage from 1921 to 1926, and would provide the context for Franco's transformation from promising officer to national hero. The Rif War began with one of the worst military disasters in Spanish history. In July 1921, at Annual in northeastern Morocco, a Spanish force of approximately 20,000 men was virtually annihilated by Rif forces in a matter of days. Spanish casualties were catastrophic. Estimates range from 8,000 to 13,000 dead, with thousands more captured or missing. Weapons, supplies, and equipment worth millions were abandoned to the enemy or destroyed to prevent capture. It was a humiliation that shocked Spain to its core and raised fundamental questions about the entire Moroccan enterprise. The Rif forces were led by Abd el-Krim, one of the most remarkable figures of early 20th century anti-colonial resistance. Abd el-Krim was not a mere tribal warlord, but an educated, sophisticated leader who had studied in Spain itself and understood European politics and military organization. He united multiple traditionally fractious Berber tribes under his leadership and established what he called the Republic of the Rif, complete with governmental institutions, a flag, and diplomatic correspondence with international media. He was, in essence, leading an anti-colonial national liberation movement decades before such movements would sweep through Africa and Asia. For Spain, the disaster at Annual created a profound political crisis. Public opinion turned sharply against the Moroccan War. Opposition politicians demanded investigations into military competence and political leadership. The officer corps itself was divided about strategy and tactics. King Alfonso X faced criticism for his support of the military adventure. The entire Spanish political system seemed on the verge of collapse. This was the desperate context in which Franco and the Spanish Foreign Legion would make their reputation and quite possibly save Spain's colonial presence in Morocco. Under Franco's leadership, the Legion rapidly developed into a legendary fighting force. The unit gained a reputation for exceptional discipline, aggressive tactics, and remarkable effectiveness in combat, as well as for brutal treatment of enemy combatants and civilians. The Legion's tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive assault, rapid movement, and psychological intimidation of the enemy. Prisoners were rarely taken. Villages suspected of supporting Abd el-Krim faced harsh collective punishment. Bodies of fallen enemies were sometimes mutilated as a terror tactic. These methods were militarily effective, but morally troubling. The Legion's conduct in Morocco established patterns of behavior: summary execution, collective punishment, terror tactics that would reappear on a larger scale during the Spanish Civil War 15 years later. Franco apparently viewed such methods as militarily necessary and showed no moral qualms about their use. He believed he was fighting a war of civilization against barbarism, and in such wars, conventional rules did not apply. By 1923, Franco commanded the entire Spanish Foreign Legion as its highest-ranking officer. Milan Astray had been wounded yet again. His injuries were so extensive that he could no longer effectively lead in the field and stepped back from direct command while retaining a ceremonial role. At 30 years old, Franco was leading Spain's most elite military unit in its most important military campaign in decades. His success and growing fame caught the personal attention of King Alfonso III, who summoned Franco for a private audience in Madrid. This royal recognition elevated Franco's status considerably within both Spanish military and civilian society. He was no longer just a talented officer rising through the ranks. He was becoming a figure of genuine national significance, someone the king consulted personally on military matters. The political context was equally significant for Franco's future. In September 1923, with the country in political chaos following the Annual disaster and other crises, General Miguel Primo de Rivera staged a military coup with King Alfonso XIII's explicit blessing. The coup established a military dictatorship that would last until 1930. Primo de Rivera's regime embraced the motto, country, religion, monarchy, principles that resonated deeply with Franco's own emerging political convictions. The coup established a crucial precedent in Franco's mind. Military intervention in politics was not just acceptable but necessary and even patriotic when civilian politicians failed to govern effectively and threatened national unity and order. Franco's pivotal role in finally ending the Rif War between 1925 and 1926 cemented his status as a national hero and one of Spain's most celebrated military leaders. The turning point came when Spain and France finally coordinated their military efforts effectively. Abd el-Krim, fighting powerful enemies on two fronts simultaneously, could not sustain his resistance indefinitely despite his tactical brilliance and his fighters' courage. In September 1925, Spanish and French forces launched a major combined operation. the Alhucemas landing, which represented one of the first successful opposed amphibious operations in modern military history. Spanish forces, with Franco's legion at the forefront, landed on the Rif coast and pushed inland toward Abd el-Krim's strongholds. The operation was risky and could easily have ended in disaster, but Franco's aggressive tactics and the legion's discipline proved decisive. Within months of the Alhucemas landing, Abd el-Krim's forces were in retreat across the Rif. By May 1926, recognizing that continued resistance was futile, Abd el-Krim surrendered to French authorities. The Rif War was over. Spain's colonial position in Morocco was secured. The reward for Franco's crucial role came swiftly. On February 3, 1926, at age 33, Franco was promoted to brigadier general. He became one of the youngest generals, not just in Spain, but in all of Europe. His reputation as a military prodigy was now unassailable. He was not just a successful officer, but a genuine national hero, celebrated in the Spanish press, his name known throughout the country, his opinions sought on military and even political matters. This fame and reputation built in Morocco would prove absolutely crucial in the years ahead. Franco's subsequent rise to supreme power in the 1930s was predicated almost entirely on the military prestige he had earned in North Africa. In 1928, the Primo de Rivera government appointed Franco as director of the newly established General Military Academy in Zaragoza. This represented a significant shift from combat command to institutional leadership and education. The academy was intended to modernize Spanish military training, incorporating lessons from World War I and creating a new generation of professional officers suited to modern warfare. This position was ideal for Franco. It allowed him to shape future Spanish officers according to his deeply held values: discipline, hierarchy, devotion to Catholic faith, Spanish nationalism, and commitment to military values over civilian politics. He emphasized practical military skills over academic theory. He stressed the absolute importance of personal courage and leading from the front. He cultivated among his cadets an image of the army as the ultimate defender of Spanish civilization against internal disorder and external threats. The curriculum under Franco's direction included heavy doses of Spanish history, emphasizing the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign, to drive Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula and Spain's imperial Golden Age under the Catholic monarchs and the Habsburgs. This historical narrative portrayed Spain as a fundamentally Catholic nation with a special historical mission. It cast internal dissent, regional separatism, and leftist politics as threats to national unity comparable to the medieval Muslim presence, existential dangers requiring military vigilance and, if necessary, military action. Many cadets who graduated from Zaragoza under Franco's leadership would later form the core of his support during the Civil War. His influence over them and their intense personal loyalty to him would prove crucial to his eventual seizure of power. These officers didn't just respect Franco professionally, many revered him as an embodiment of military virtue and Spanish patriotism. Franco's comfortable tenure at Zaragoza would not last. Political storms were gathering that would sweep away the regime that had elevated him and fundamentally reshape Spanish politics. By 1930, Spain was approaching a breaking point. General Primo de Rivera's dictatorship, which had brought Franco preferment and prestige, was crumbling under the weight of economic crisis and mounting political discontent from virtually every sector of society. The global economic depression that began with the 1929 Wall Street crash devastated Spain's already fragile economy. Unemployment soared dramatically. Businesses failed across the country. Agricultural prices collapsed, devastating rural areas. The government's finances deteriorated rapidly, making it increasingly difficult to maintain basic services or pay government employees, including the military. Simultaneously, Primo de Rivera's authoritarian methods had alienated broad segments of Spanish society. Intellectuals and professionals deeply resented censorship and political repression. Workers and peasants gained nothing from a dictatorship that primarily protected elite interests. Regional nationalists in Catalonia and the Basque country chafed under Madrid's centralized control and cultural suppression. Even significant elements of the military, ironically, the dictatorship's foundation, grew disenchanted with Primo de Rivera's leadership and the political isolation it brought. In January 1930, facing mounting opposition from all sides and no longer enjoying King Alfonso V's full confidence, Primo de Rivera resigned and went into exile in Paris, where he died just 2 months later. His death symbolized the end of an entire era in Spanish politics. The fall of Primo de Rivera's dictatorship opened a period of intense political instability and ferment. King Alfonso XIII attempted to restore some form of constitutional government, but he was fatally compromised by his association with and support for the dictatorship. Republicans, socialists, and anarchists organized openly in the streets, demanding the king's abdication and the establishment of a democratic republic. Municipal elections were called for. April 12, 1931, these elections quickly became understood as a referendum on the monarchy itself, rather than merely a choice of local governments. In Spain's major cities, Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Seville, Bilbao, Republican and socialist candidates won overwhelming victories. The countryside remained more conservative and monarchist, but the urban results were politically and symbolically decisive. King Alfonso XIII, reading the political winds and genuinely hoping to avoid civil conflict, made a momentous decision. On April 14, 1931, without formally abdicating the throne, he departed Spain. He left a carefully worded statement saying he was temporarily leaving to allow the Spanish people to determine their future without his presence influencing events. In reality, though he maintained the fiction of a temporary absence, he would never return to Spain. That same day, April 14, 1931, crowds celebrated in the streets of Madrid, Barcelona, and other cities as the Second Spanish Republic was formally proclaimed. The Republican tricolor flag, red, yellow, and purple, replaced the red and yellow monarchist banner on government buildings. After centuries of monarchy stretching back to the unification of Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella, Spain would attempt democracy and republican government. For Franco, the proclamation of the Republic represented both a personal and professional catastrophe. The new republican government viewed military officers like Franco, intimately associated with the monarchy, with Primo de Rivera's fallen dictatorship, and with brutal colonial warfare, with deep suspicion and outright hostility. The Republic's early policies toward the military were driven by several interconnected concerns. The officer corps was widely perceived as bloated, inefficient, politically reactionary, and a drain on national resources. Many officers received substantial salaries without performing meaningful duties. The military consumed a disproportionate share of the national budget while demonstrating questionable effectiveness. The Moroccan Wars had been expensive bloodbaths that served no clear national interest. Manuel Azaña, who became the Republic's Minister of War and later Prime Minister, implemented sweeping military reforms. The government offered early retirement with full pay to officers willing to leave active service. Thousands accepted, significantly reducing the officer corps. More dramatically for Franco personally, the General Military Academy in Zaragoza, his command and his power base, was closed entirely, viewed as a bastion of monarchist sentiment and military privilege incompatible with republican values. Franco found himself reassigned to a minor posting in Coruna, far from the centers of power and influence. From directing Spain's premier military academy, he was reduced to essentially bureaucratic duties reviewing coastal defenses. This demotion was personally humiliating for a man who had grown accustomed to national fame, institutional authority, and access to Spain's political elite. Yet Franco, ever the pragmatist and firm believer in military discipline, publicly declared his willingness to serve the Republic. He issued statements affirming that professional soldiers obeyed legitimate government regardless of personal political preferences. This acceptance, however reluctant and however contradicted by his private views, reflected his deeply ingrained belief in military discipline and chain of command. But privately, Franco seethed with resentment. He viewed the Republic as fundamentally illegitimate, the product of urban mobs and demagogic politicians who had overturned Spain's legitimate traditional order. He saw the military reforms as attacks on the army itself and on Spanish nationalism, motivated by hostility to military values and patriotic sentiment. He opposed the Republic's aggressive anti-clericalism, its efforts to dramatically reduce church influence over education and social policy. He feared and despised its tolerance for regional autonomy movements in Catalonia and the Basque Country, viewing these as existential threats to Spanish unity that would inevitably lead to national disintegration. Elections in 1933 brought conservatives to power, temporarily reversing many Republican reforms. Franco's fortunes improved significantly. He received better postings and in 1934 won promotion to Major General, a remarkable achievement for a man still in his early 40s. That October 1934, miners in the northern province of Asturias launched a violent armed uprising. They were protesting the conservative government's rollback of reforms and the inclusion of the right-wing CIDE party in the cabinet. The uprising was serious and well organized. Miners seized control of much of Asturias, establishing what they called the Asturian Workers' Commune. They armed themselves with dynamite from the mines and weapons captured from overwhelmed police and military posts. The government, viewing this as an attempted communist revolution that threatened the state's very existence, responded with overwhelming force. Franco was placed in charge of suppressing the revolt, commanding forces that included the Spanish, Foreign Legion and Moroccan colonial troops, the same brutal forces that had fought in the rift. Franco's forces crushed the uprising with terrible efficiency over 2 weeks of fighting. The tactics perfected in Morocco, summary executions, torture of prisoners to extract information, indiscriminate violence against civilian populations suspected of supporting the rebels, were now applied in Spain itself against Spanish workers. Conservative estimates place deaths at around 1,000 tons, though some historians suggest the true figure was closer to 2,000. Many thousands more were imprisoned, often in appalling conditions. Miners' communities were subjected to harsh collective punishment and reprisals. Franco showed absolutely no hesitation in ordering this violence against Spanish civilians. He described the Asturias uprising not as a labor dispute or even a political insurrection, but as an existential civilizational conflict, a frontier war waged by communists and socialists against Spain itself, against Christian civilization, against order and tradition. This apocalyptic rhetoric framed political opponents not as fellow Spaniards with different views, but as enemies of civilization itself requiring elimination. The Asturias insurrection proved a crucial turning point for both Spain and Franco personally. For Spain, it demonstrated how deep and unbridgeable the divisions had become. Workers were willing to take up arms against the state. The government was willing to use colonial violence and foreign troops against its own citizens. The possibility of peaceful political compromise was rapidly vanishing. For Franco, Asturias cemented his reputation in conservative circles as the man who had saved Spain from communist revolution. Conservatives throughout Spain praised him as a national savior. The political right increasingly looked to the military, and to Franco specifically, as the ultimate guarantor of social order. Simultaneously, the left learned to see Franco as a ruthless enemy who would show no mercy. His appointment as chief of the army's general staff in May 1935 reflected his dramatically elevated status. But the conservative government's time was limited. A series of corruption scandals toppled the administration. New elections were called for February 1936. Spain's left, learning hard lessons from past divisions and defeats, united into the Popular Front, an electoral coalition of socialists, communists, anarchists, and republicans. They campaigned on a platform of amnesty for political prisoners from Asturias and other conflicts, expanded labor rights, acceleration of land reform, and increased regional autonomy. The right also attempted unity, but fractures and competing agendas remained. Monarchists who wanted to restore Alfonso faith, Catholics primarily concerned with protecting church privileges, and the fascist Falange Party competed for leadership, while trying to present a united front against the left. The February 1936 elections were bitterly contested. The Popular Front won with approximately 47% of the vote compared to 46% for the right-wing coalition, an extremely narrow popular vote margin. However, Spain's electoral system translated this razor-thin advantage into a more substantial parliamentary majority. Manuel Azaña became president and began forming a government. For conservative Spain, including the military, the church, and the propertied classes, this outcome was absolutely intolerable. The Popular Front's victory seemed to herald radical transformation, expropriation of church property, radical land redistribution that would destroy traditional estates, regional autonomy that would lead to national disintegration, expanded workers' power that would undermine business, and ultimately, communist revolution that would destroy Christian civilization itself. Almost immediately after the Popular Front's victory, military officers began conspiring to overthrow the Republic through armed force. The planning was extensive and careful, involving multiple generals and colonels stationed across Spain and in Morocco. The conspirators sought support from monarchist organizations, from the Falange, from Catholic groups. They made contact with Mussolini's Italy and Nazi Germany, seeking promises of weapons and military support. Franco, having been sent to the Canary Islands as military commander, a posting that was effectively internal exile, removing him from mainland Spain, initially remained conspicuously aloof from the active plotting. His reasons for this initial caution were complex: genuine uncertainty about whether a coup would actually succeed, concern about maintaining military unity, calculation that premature commitment might damage his reputation, and his characteristic extreme caution about committing to major actions until success seemed highly probable. But as spring turned to summer and plans became increasingly concrete, the conspirators recognized they desperately needed Franco's participation. His unparalleled reputation, particularly his command over the Army of Africa, Spain's most effective, best trained, and most ruthless military force, was absolutely crucial to success. The Army of Africa, composed of the Spanish Foreign Legion and Moroccan colonial troops, was battle-hardened, intensely loyal to its commanders, and far superior to mainland garrison troops. Without Franco's participation and the Army of Africa's involvement, the coup risked catastrophic failure. In June 1936, emissaries traveled secretly to the Canary Islands. Franco met with fellow conspirators in a forest on Tenerife to avoid surveillance by Republican authorities. After lengthy discussions and considerable persuasion, Franco finally committed to the conspiracy, agreeing to lead the Army of Africa in the coming military uprising against the Republic. The uprising began on July 17, 1936, in Spanish Morocco, one day earlier than originally planned, due to operational circumstances and fears that Republican authorities were becoming aware of the plot. A British aircraft, chartered under false pretenses, flew Franco from the Canary Islands to Morocco, where he immediately took command of the Army of Africa. The following day, July 18, military garrisons throughout mainland Spain declared against the Republic. Officers arrested Republican officials, seized key government buildings, and attempted to take control of their cities. The conspirators' plan was straightforward. Military units would seize key cities and installations across Spain. The government, lacking reliable military forces, would collapse within days. A military junta would take power, restore order, and reverse Republican reforms. But the plan failed catastrophically in most of Spain's major population centers. The coup succeeded in parts of Spain, garrisons in rural Galicia, Old Castile, Navarre, and parts of Andalusia and Aragon came over to the rebels. Rural areas, generally more conservative and Catholic, largely fell under rebel control. The wealthy and the church threw their support behind the uprising. However, the coup failed utterly in Spain's major cities and industrial regions. In Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Bilbao, and Malaga, workers armed themselves with weapons seized from arsenals and resisted fiercely. Loyal security forces, particularly the assault guards and significant portions of the civil guard, fought against rebel military units. By July 20th, it was absolutely clear the uprising had not achieved its objectives. The Republican government survived in the capital and retained control of most major urban centers. Spain was now divided, both geographically and ideologically, in ways that made compromise or negotiation impossible. Neither side could immediately defeat the other militarily. What had been planned as a swift 48-hour coup had become a civil war, a conflict that would rage for nearly 3 years, kill hundreds of thousands, and leave scars on Spanish society that persist to this day. The rebels, now calling themselves nationalists to emphasize their claim to represent authentic Spanish nationalism, controlled approximately 1/3 of Spanish territory. Critically, they lacked Spain's major industrial centers and most of the country's economic resources. The Republic held most industrial capacity, virtually all major cities except Seville, the nation's gold reserves, and the loyalty of most of the navy. Both sides immediately sought foreign support, recognizing that Spain's internal resources were insufficient to guarantee victory. The Spanish Civil War was about to become internationalized, transformed into a proxy conflict in the wider ideological struggle between fascism and communism that would culminate in World War II. Nazi Germany provided crucial early support that quite possibly determined the war's eventual outcome. German transport aircraft, the Junkers U-52, conducted history's first major military airlift operation, ferrying Franco's Army of Africa from Morocco across the Strait of Gibraltar to mainland Spain in August 1936. Without this airlift, Franco's most effective forces would have remained trapped in Morocco, unable to influence the mainland fighting. The Republican Navy controlled the straits and would have prevented any attempt at sea-based transport. Germany subsequently sent the Condor Legion, a force of aircraft, tanks, and specialized troops that would remain actively engaged in Spain throughout the war. For Nazi Germany, Spain offered an invaluable testing ground for new military equipment and tactics. Luftwaffe pilots gained critical combat experience. New aircraft designs were tested under actual war conditions. Tactical doctrines, particularly regarding close air support for ground forces and strategic bombing of cities, were developed and refined. Lessons learned in Spain would be applied across Europe in World War II. Fascist Italy provided even more extensive support to Franco's nationalists. Mussolini, eager to expand Italian influence and demonstrate fascist solidarity, sent ground troops. Ultimately, over 70,000 Italian soldiers would serve in Spain at various times. Italian aircraft, tanks, artillery, and military advisors reinforced nationalist forces throughout the war. Mussolini viewed Spanish intervention as advancing Italian influence in the Mediterranean while undermining France's strategic position. The Soviet Union supported the Republicans, motivated partly by ideological solidarity with the Spanish left, but also by strategic calculations about preventing a fascist Spain that would threaten France and Mediterranean security. Soviet military advisors arrived to train Republican forces. Soviet aircraft and tanks were supplied to Republican armies, though notably at high financial cost, paid for by shipping Spain's substantial gold reserves to Moscow, a transaction that would prove extremely controversial. Perhaps more significant than official Soviet support was the mobilization of international volunteers. The international brigades, composed of communists, socialists, anarchists, and anti-fascists from across Europe and North America, fought for the Republic. Approximately 35,000–40,000 volunteers from some 50 countries served in the international brigades at various times. They included writers like George Orwell and journalists like Ernest Hemingway, who would immortalize the conflict. Many were idealists who genuinely saw Spain as the front line in the fight against international fascism. Meanwhile, Britain, France, and the United States declared official neutrality, establishing a non-intervention committee that proved utterly ineffective and arguably counterproductive. Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union simply ignored non-intervention agreements while officially signing them, while Britain and France scrupulously observed the restrictions, effectively handicapping the Republic, while doing nothing to prevent nationalist rearmament. Franco's immediate military strategy prioritized capturing Madrid. Military logic suggested that seizing the capital would decapitate the Republican government and end the war swiftly before the Republic could organize effective resistance or receive substantial foreign aid. Having successfully airlifted the Army of Africa to Andalusia in August 1936, Franco began a methodical advance northward on Madrid. His forces swept through Extremadura, brushing aside hastily organized Republican militia units composed largely of enthusiastic but militarily inexperienced workers and peasants. Towns and villages fell in rapid succession. Franco's forces gained an immediate and terrifying reputation for shocking brutality. Mass executions of suspected Republicans, leftists, union members, and anyone who had supported the Popular Front became systematic routine. In Badajoz in August 1936, following the city's capture, an estimated 2,000 to 4,000 Republican militia members and civilians were systematically executed in the city's bullring and surrounding streets, one of the war's first major atrocities. This calculated terror served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple revenge. It paralyzed civilian resistance in areas yet to be conquered, spread panic that often caused Republican defensive positions to collapse before nationalist forces, even arrived and discouraged potential opponents from offering resistance. But it also absolutely guaranteed that the war would be fought without mercy on either side and that political compromise would be impossible. By October 1936, Franco's forces had reached Madrid's outskirts, having advanced hundreds of kilometers in just 2 months. The city's fall seemed imminent and inevitable. The Republican government prepared to evacuate to Valencia. Foreign diplomats began leaving. Madrid appeared doomed. But Madrid held in one of the war's most dramatic and consequential surprises. Republican defenders, significantly reinforced by newly arrived Soviet equipment and the 1st International Brigade volunteers, mounted a desperate and ultimately successful defense. The slogan, "No pasarán, they shall not pass," deliberately echoing Verdun's defense in World War I, became the Republic's rallying cry. Street fighting raged through Madrid's University City district for weeks. Buildings changed hands multiple times. Casualties mounted horrifically on both sides. Franco's forces, despite their superior training and equipment, lacked sufficient strength to overcome determined urban defense by highly motivated troops fighting for their homes. The siege of Madrid had begun. It would last, in various forms, for the entire war. Franco's failure to capture Madrid in late 1936 was strategically decisive. The possibility of a swift nationalist victory had permanently passed. The war would be protracted, grinding, and increasingly bitter. Franco would need to systematically conquer Republican-held territory piece by piece. With Madrid impregnable for the moment, Franco turned his attention northward to eliminate Republican strongholds in Asturias, Santander, and especially the Basque country. The Basque region presented unique complications. Basque nationalism was primarily conservative and Catholic, making Basques ideologically closer to nationalists than to the anti-clerical Republic. However, the Republic had granted the Basque country substantial autonomy, creating a Basque government that remained loyal to Madrid. Many Basques fought for the Republic not from leftist conviction, but from regional nationalism and the Republic's respect for Basque identity. In spring 1937, Franco launched a major offensive against Bilbao, the Basque country's largest city and most important industrial center. The campaign would be remembered not primarily for its military conduct, but for the war's single most infamous atrocity. On April 26, 1937, the small Basque town of Guernica became the target of sustained aerial bombardment. German Condor Legion and Italian Aviazione Legionaria aircraft bombed Guernica for over 2 hours. The town, located in Biscay province, held special symbolic significance for Basques as the historic seat of Basque traditional government and liberties. Guernica possessed virtually no military significance. No major military installations were present. The attack deliberately occurred on market day, when the town was crowded with civilians from surrounding villages. The bombing employed a systematic combination of high explosive bombs to destroy buildings, incendiary devices to start fires, and machine gun strafing of civilians fleeing into surrounding fields. The death toll remains historically disputed, with estimates ranging from 300 to 1,600 dead. Much of the town was destroyed. The attack shocked international opinion and became an immediate symbol of fascist brutality and the emerging horrors of modern aerial warfare against civilian populations. Pablo Picasso's monumental painting, Guernica, commissioned by the Republican government for the 1937 Paris International Exposition, ensured the atrocity would never be forgotten. The painting became perhaps the most famous anti-war artwork of the 20th century, its fragmented, anguished figures capturing both the specific horror of Guernica and the broader catastrophe of modern warfare. Franco's forces initially denied all responsibility, claiming absurdly that Republicans had destroyed the town themselves to create anti-nationalist propaganda. This transparent lie convinced virtually no one. Guernica revealed with absolute clarity the nationalists' willingness to employ systematic terror bombing against civilian populations, tactics that would reappear on vastly larger scales in World War II. Following Guernica and the international outcry it generated, nationalist forces continued their methodical northern offensive, largely undeterred by international condemnation. Bilbao, heavily fortified and defended by a ring of fortifications called the Iron Belt, fell on June 19, 1937 after a grueling 2-month siege. The conquest of the Basque country was completed by October 1937, giving Franco control of crucial industrial resources, steel mills, shipyards, arms factories, and eliminating a significant Republican stronghold that had tied down substantial nationalist forces. Santander fell to nationalist forces in August 1937, and Asturias, scene of Franco's 1934 triumph against the miners, was conquered in October 1937. By late 1937, the nationalists controlled all of northern Spain from Galicia to the French border. Republican territory was now geographically limited to 3 main areas: the central Meseta, centered on Madrid, the eastern Mediterranean coast including Valencia, and Catalonia in the northeast including Barcelona. More critically, the Republic had lost significant industrial capacity and economic resources while suffering heavy casualties in futile defensive campaigns. The strategic initiative had clearly shifted to Franco's forces. In December 1937, in a desperate attempt to regain strategic initiative and relieve pressure on Madrid, Republicans launched a major offensive to capture Teruel, a provincial capital in Aragon located inland from the Mediterranean coast. The attack had multiple strategic objectives, demonstrating continued Republican offensive capacity to boost morale and maintain foreign support, disrupting nationalist plans for further offensives, and potentially severing nationalist communications between northern and southern zones. Franco, unable to tolerate the loss of Teruel and recognizing an opportunity to destroy Republican offensive capability, responded by immediately diverting massive forces from other sectors. both sides rapidly escalated their commitment. What began as a limited Republican offensive transformed into one of the war's largest and most brutal battles. The fighting occurred under horrific conditions. The winter of 1937-38 was Spain's coldest in 20 years, with temperatures dropping well below freezing for weeks. Soldiers fought in deep snow and ice, often without adequate winter clothing, proper shelter, or sufficient food. Frostbite casualties were extensive on both sides. Conditions were grimly reminiscent of the Eastern Front in World War I, with men freezing to death in trenches and soldiers' bodies preserved by cold until spring thaw. Republican forces initially captured Teruel in early January 1938 after intense street-by-street fighting that reduced much of the city to ruins. But Franco launched an overwhelming counter-offensive, committing armor, artillery, and massive air support. Throughout January and February, vicious fighting raged for control of the devastated city and the surrounding strategic heights. Casualties were absolutely staggering for both sides. Each suffered over 60,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, missing, and captured. Entire divisions were effectively destroyed. Elite units on both sides were annihilated. Teruel itself changed hands multiple times, each transition marked by executions of prisoners and massacres of wounded soldiers unable to evacuate. In mid-February 1938, Franco's forces finally recaptured Teruel permanently. The Republicans had briefly held the city, but at catastrophic cost. The Battle of Teruel had utterly exhausted Republican offensive capability and military reserves. Their best units had been committed to Teruel and were now destroyed or so severely damaged as to be militarily ineffective. They completely lacked reserves to replace these devastating losses. Franco, with his characteristic methodical approach, immediately recognized Republican weakness and moved to exploit it ruthlessly. In March 1938, he launched a major offensive eastward through Aragon toward the Mediterranean coast, the Aragon Offensive. Republican defenses, critically weakened by Teruel's losses, crumbled rapidly. Nationalist forces advanced quickly through Aragon, capturing town after town, overwhelming demoralized Republican units. By mid-April 1938, nationalist troops reached the Mediterranean Sea at the small town of Vinaròs. Achieving a strategically decisive result, Republican territory was now split in two. Catalonia in the northeast was completely cut off from the central Republican zone around Madrid and Valencia. Coordination between Republican zones became nearly impossible. Resources, reinforcements, and supplies could not be transferred between zones. The already desperately strained Republic was now fatally fragmented. The Republic's final desperate gamble came in July 1938 with the Ebro Offensive. Republican forces, gathering their last reserves and remaining capable units, launched a surprise attack across the Ebro River in Catalonia. This represented a last-ditch attempt to reverse the strategic situation, reconnect separated Republican zones, and demonstrate to the world that the Republic could still mount effective offensive operations. Initially, the offensive achieved tactical surprise and limited success. Republican forces crossed the Ebro River and advanced several kilometers, capturing significant territory and taking prisoners. But Franco, rather than responding with mobile defense or strategic withdrawal, deliberately chose to fight a battle of attrition. He committed massive reinforcements, concentrated artillery and air power, and determined to bleed the Republicans white regardless of nationalist casualties. The Battle of the Ebro raged for nearly 4 months, from July to November 1938, making it the war's longest and one of its bloodiest single battles. Combined casualties exceeded 100,000 killed and wounded. The fighting was particularly savage. Positions were taken and retaken multiple times, often in hand-to-hand combat. Both sides exhibited extraordinary courage and endurance, but ultimately, Franco's greater resources prevailed. Republicans lost irreplaceable numbers of their remaining experienced troops, officers, and virtually all their remaining equipment, including artillery, tanks and aircraft. When the battle finally ended in mid-November 1938, Republican forces had been pushed back across the Ebro. Their offensive capability was completely finished. They had nothing left, no reserves, no equipment, and most critically, no hope. With the Republic's military capacity exhausted following the Ebro disaster, Franco prepared his final offensives. Catalonia, geographically isolated from the rest of Republican Spain and now virtually defenseless, was the obvious first target. On December 23, 1938, nationalist forces invaded Catalonia in overwhelming strength. Cut off from support, outnumbered, and lacking equipment to resist effectively, Republican forces could mount only sporadic, localized resistance. The nationalist advance was rapid and largely unopposed. Barcelona, Spain's second-largest city and a Republican stronghold throughout the entire war, fell on January 26, 1939. The city's fall was both symbolically and practically decisive. Barcelona had been a Republican fortress since July 1936. Its loss made absolutely clear to everyone, Republicans, nationalists, and international observers, that the war was effectively over. Only the formal end remained. Hundreds of thousands of Republican soldiers and civilians fled toward the French border, creating a massive humanitarian catastrophe. France, initially reluctant, eventually opened its borders to this desperate exodus. Approximately 500,000 Spanish Republicans, soldiers, political leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary families crossed into France in early 1939. They were interned in hastily constructed camps on French beaches under appalling conditions, minimal shelter, inadequate food, poor sanitation, and little medical care. Thousands would die in these camps from disease and exposure. Many would remain imprisoned in these camps for years. Some would still be there when Germany invaded France in 1940, whereupon they would be transferred to Nazi concentration camps, having fled Franco only to end up in Hitler's hands. In late February 1939, Britain and France officially recognized Franco's government as Spain's sole legitimate government. This diplomatic recognition, occurring while the Republic still technically existed and controlled some territory, was a devastating blow to Republican morale and international legitimacy. By early March 1939, the Republic was reduced to the central zone around Madrid and Valencia. The government, having relocated repeatedly from Madrid to Valencia to Barcelona, now existed only in fragmentary, dysfunctional form and had clearly lost effective control over remaining Republican territory. On March 5, 1939, Colonel Segismundo Casado led a military coup within the Republican zone, overthrowing Prime Minister Juan Negrin's government. Casado believed that negotiated surrender might achieve better terms than Negrin's stated intention to resist to the bitter end. Brief fighting occurred between pro-Casado and pro-Negrin forces, Republicans fighting Republicans even as Franco prepared the final blow. Casado sent representatives to negotiate with Franco, desperately hoping for guarantees of safety for Republican soldiers and officials. Franco's terms were brutally simple and completely unchanged from previous offers: unconditional surrender, absolutely no negotiation, no guarantees whatsoever. Casado, with no alternatives remaining, had no choice but to accept. On March 26, 1939, Franco launched the final offensive against the remaining Republican zones. His forces encountered minimal resistance. Republican units were surrendering en masse, often without firing a shot. Soldiers simply walked away, hoping to reach home and disappear before nationalist forces arrived. Madrid, besieged since October 1936 but never conquered, fell on March 28, 1939. Valencia surrendered on March 30th. The last Republican holdout, the Mediterranean port city of Alicante, where thousands had gathered desperately hoping for ships to evacuate them, capitulated on April 1st. On April 1st, 1939, Franco made a radio broadcast that was transmitted throughout Spain. In his characteristically flat, unemotional voice, He announced total and complete victory for the nationalist cause. The Spanish Civil War was officially over. The war's human cost was staggering and remains subject to historical debate. Estimates of total deaths from combat, executions, bombing, disease, and starvation range from 300,000 to over 500,000. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded, many permanently disabled. Entire cities lay in ruins. Spain's economy was utterly devastated. Society was traumatized and bitterly, perhaps permanently, divided, and critically, the killing was far from over. Franco's first act as Spain's undisputed ruler was systematic political violence on a scale that shocked even some of his own supporters. The White Terror, so named in contrast to Republican violence during the war, termed the Red Terror, represented one of the regime's greatest and most enduring crimes. In the weeks and months following the war's end, Franco's regime executed at least 50,000 Republicans through military tribunals and summary proceedings. Many historians place the actual figure substantially higher, possibly exceeding 100,000, when including deaths from executions without any judicial process whatsoever. These were not battlefield casualties, but systematic political killings carried out methodically after hostilities had ceased. The process was grimly efficient and brutally simple. Suspected Republicans, identified through denunciations by neighbors, employers, or local Falange members, were arrested by police or military units. They were subjected to brief military tribunals that offered only the pretense of justice, with predetermined verdicts and no genuine opportunity for defense. Many received no trial whatsoever. Executions typically occurred in the early morning. Hours, the paseos or final walks to execution sites, became routine throughout Spain. Bodies were dumped in mass graves, often unmarked or simply left in ditches as warnings to others. The victims included not just Republican political and military leaders, but also teachers suspected of leftist sympathies, union members, local officials who had served Republican administrations, intellectuals, and ordinary workers who had supported the Popular Front. In many cases, mere membership in leftist organizations years before the war was sufficient for execution. The regime was not seeking justice, but rather the complete elimination of political opposition and anyone who might conceivably resist Franco's rule. Tens of thousands more filled prisons and concentration camps established specifically to hold Republican prisoners. Conditions in these facilities were deliberately appalling: severe overcrowding, systematic malnutrition, endemic disease, inadequate medical care, and routine physical abuse. The prison at Burgos alone held over 8,000 prisoners in facilities designed for a few hundred. Some prisoners would remain in these camps and prisons for years, even decades. The last concentration camp at Miranda de Ebro near Burgos wasn't closed until 1947. Perhaps 500,000 Spaniards fled the country during and immediately after the war to France, Mexico, Argentina, the Soviet Union, and other destinations. Spain lost an entire generation of intellectuals, scientists, artists, writers, skilled workers, and political leaders. The cultural and economic cost of this massive exile was incalculable. Many would never return to Spain. Some of their descendants, born in exile, have never seen their ancestral homeland. Those who remained in Spain faced systematic discrimination that would persist for decades. Former Republicans were blacklisted from employment in government, education, and often private industry. They were denied ration cards during the hungry 1940s, essentially sentenced to starvation. They faced constant surveillance by police and Falange informants. Their children were barred from universities and faced systematic obstacles to employment and advancement. This persecution created a climate of fear that permeated Spanish society. People learned not to discuss politics, not to trust neighbors, to hide their past. Among the regime's most heinous practices was the systematic abduction of children from Republican families, a crime whose full extent is still being uncovered today. Beginning during the Civil War and continuing through the 1940s and into the 1950s, tens of thousands, quite possibly hundreds of thousands of children were forcibly removed from their biological parents. The regime justified this monstrous practice as rescuing children from undesirable political and moral influences. Official ideology held that leftist parents were inherently unfit, atheistic, immoral, dangerous to children's proper development. Removing children and placing them with proper Catholic nationalist families was portrayed as humanitarian child protection. In reality, this was calculated social engineering through systematic kidnapping. Children who would have been raised in Republican, socialist, or anarchist families were instead raised as conservative Catholics and Francoists. Their political loyalties were deliberately shaped from earliest childhood. Their family connections and identities were deliberately severed and erased. Birth certificates were routinely falsified. Mothers were told their newborns had died during childbirth, when babies were actually taken and given to approved families. Children were told their parents had abandoned them or died. Many victims never learned their true origins. Even today, DNA testing is helping some stolen children find their biological families, but for many the truth came too late. Biological parents died without knowing their children's fates. Catholic Church institutions, particularly religious orders running hospitals and orphanages, were deeply complicit in these crimes. Nuns and priests facilitated the kidnappings, falsified documents, and maintained the system. The Church's moral authority was deployed to legitimize child theft as charitable work. Just 5 months after the Spanish Civil War concluded, Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. World War II had erupted across Europe, and Franco faced a crucial decision about Spain's role. Simple logic suggested Franco would immediately join his allies Hitler and Mussolini. After all, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy had provided absolutely crucial support during the Civil War. German airlift operation, the Condor Legion, Italian ground troops and equipment all had arguably made Franco's victory possible. Ideologically, Franco shared much with the Axis powers: authoritarianism, anti-communism, hostility to liberal democracy, and opposition to the post-Versailles international order. Yet Franco surprised many observers, both in Spain and internationally, by declaring neutrality. This neutrality was later modified to non-belligerency, a deliberately ambiguous status suggesting sympathy with the Axis, without actual military participation. Multiple factors explained this initially cautious decision. First, and most obviously, Spain was utterly exhausted. 3 years of catastrophically destructive civil war had devastated the country completely. The economy was shattered, with industrial production at perhaps half of pre-war levels. Infrastructure, roads, railways, bridges, was extensively damaged. Cities had been bombed. Agricultural production had collapsed. The population was malnourished. Military forces, though victorious, were depleted and desperately needed rest, reorganization, and re-equipment. Joining another major war immediately was practically impossible regardless of political will. Second, Britain controlled the seas through overwhelming naval superiority. Spain depended critically on imported food, fuel, and raw materials. British naval power meant Spain couldn't risk open Anglo-American hostility without facing starvation and complete economic collapse. Franco understood that British blockade could strangle Spain within months. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, Franco wasn't Hitler or Mussolini, despite superficial ideological similarities. His ideology was conservative authoritarianism and Catholic nationalism rather than revolutionary totalitarian fascism. He had no grandiose ambitions for imperial conquest or racial reorganization of Europe. His goals were primarily domestic, maintaining personal power and reshaping Spanish society according to traditional conservative values. However, After Germany's absolutely stunning military victories in spring 1940, conquering Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France within mere weeks, Franco's position shifted dramatically. Germany appeared militarily invincible. Britain seemed doomed to imminent defeat or negotiated surrender. Joining what appeared to be the obviously winning side might offer substantial territorial gains and cement Franco's international position. In June 1940, Franco indicated to Hitler through diplomatic channels that Spain might enter the war under appropriate conditions. Hitler, interested in securing Spain's cooperation for strategic reasons including potential operations against Gibraltar, agreed to meet Franco personally. The meeting occurred at Hendaye, France on October 23, 1940, and proved famously unproductive and mutually frustrating. Franco presented an extensive list of demands: massive German military supplies and equipment to rebuild Spanish forces, guaranteed control of Gibraltar after British defeat, large portions of French North Africa including Morocco and Algeria, and guaranteed supplies of food and fuel throughout the war. Hitler found Franco's demands excessive, his negotiating style maddeningly indirect, and his commitment questionable. Franco spoke at enormous length, circuitously, never quite committing definitely to anything. Hitler, accustomed to allies and satellites who immediately acquiesced to German demands, found Franco's elaborate caution utterly infuriating. Multiple sources report that Hitler later remarked he would rather have 3 or 4 teeth pulled than negotiate with Franco again. The meeting ended without agreement. Spain would not formally enter World War II. Franco then adopted a masterful policy of shrewd opportunism, providing symbolic support to Germany while scrupulously avoiding actions that would constitute actual belligerency and trigger British-American retaliation. He allowed formation of the División Azul, Blue Division, a unit of Spanish volunteers, to fight on Germany's Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. Approximately 47,000 Spaniards would serve in the Blue Division between 1941 and 1943. This satisfied Franco's virulent anti-communist ideology while demonstrating Spanish support for Germany without formal war entry. Crucially, Franco absolutely prohibited the Blue Division from fighting on the Western Front against American or British forces. He wanted to maintain the possibility of reasonable relations with the Western Allies. Fighting Soviet communists was ideologically consistent with Franco's worldview and politically defensible. Fighting Americans or British would be strategically suicidal. Spanish ports provided discreet support to German U-boats. Spain supplied Germany with strategically vital materials, particularly tungsten, essential for steel production used in armor and weapons, though notably at high prices. Spain traded opportunistically with both Axis and allies, playing both sides economically as the war's tide turned decisively against Germany, particularly after the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943. Franco's policy shifted accordingly toward stricter neutrality and increased accommodation of the Allies. He began withdrawing Spanish volunteers from the Eastern Front. He permitted Allied intelligence agents to operate in Spain. He allowed Allied airmen shot down over France to escape through Spain to Gibraltar. Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe could transit through Spain to safety. From 1945 until his death in 1975, Franco ruled Spain as Caudillo de España, leader of Spain, exercising absolute dictatorial power. His regime constituted one of Europe's longest-lasting 20th-century dictatorships. The regime's character combined multiple elements into a distinctive authoritarian system. It was fundamentally a military dictatorship. Franco never ceased being a general, and his authority derived from military victory rather than electoral legitimacy, party ideology, or traditional dynastic right. The army remained the regime's ultimate foundation and guarantor. The Fête de las Jontes, usually called simply the Movimiento Nacional after 1958, was the only legal political party. However, Unlike Nazi Germany or Fascist Italy, the party was clearly subordinate to Franco personally. Franco had created and controlled the party, not vice versa. Catholicism was established as the official state religion. The church regained enormous influence over education, social policy, and public morality that the Republic had stripped away. Religious instruction was mandatory in schools. Clergy received state salaries. In return, the church provided crucial ideological legitimation, describing Franco as defender of Christian civilization against atheistic communism. Regional identities were systematically suppressed. Catalan and Basque languages were banned from public use, education, and media. Regional autonomy was completely abolished. Spain was to be a unified, centralized state without regional variation or identity. Anti-communism remained Franco's most consistent ideological commitment throughout his rule. Communist and socialist parties were banned. Independent trade unions were illegal, replaced by state-controlled vertical syndicates that prevented genuine worker organization. Strikes were criminal offenses punishable by imprisonment. Women were legally subordinate to male authority, requiring male permission for basic activities like opening bank accounts, obtaining passports, or starting businesses. Many professions were closed entirely to women. Divorce, contraception, and abortion were all illegal. However, the regime gradually softened over time. The concentration camps were closed, the last in 1947. Political executions declined dramatically, though never ceased entirely. Censorship became somewhat less severe in the 1960s. Some restrictions on women were cautiously relaxed. Unofficial trade unions began operating with tacit acceptance. The Cold War proved Franco's political salvation internationally. His wartime fascist associations had left Spain diplomatically isolated. At the 1945 Potsdam Conference, the Allies specifically condemned Franco's regime. Spain was excluded from the United Nations when it was founded. Most democracies refused full diplomatic relations, but by the late 1940s, Western powers increasingly recognized the Soviet Union as the primary threat. Franco's anti-communism, once seen as extremist and troubling, now looked like strategic foresight and reliability. The United States led Spain's rehabilitation. In 1953, the Pact of Madrid established U.S.-Spanish military cooperation. The United States gained crucial air and naval bases at Morón, Torrejón, Zaragoza, and Rota, strategic installations for projecting American power into the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Middle East. In return, Spain received substantial military and economic aid and, most importantly, diplomatic legitimacy and international acceptance. In 1955, Spain joined the United Nations, ending a decade of diplomatic isolation. Franco had outlasted his critics, survived international ostracism, and lived to see his regime accepted by the international community. Spain's remaining colonial possessions dwindled during this period. Spanish Morocco gained independence in 1956 as part of broader Moroccan independence, leading to the brief Ifni War, 1957-1958. Equatorial Guinea gained independence in 1968. Spanish Sahara was abandoned in 1975 as Franco lay dying, though its status remains disputed today. However, Spain retained the North African enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla, which remain Spanish territory today. Most remarkably, Franco's regime presided over spectacular economic transformation. Spain in the 1940s was economically devastated. Rationing, malnutrition, stagnation, and poverty characterized the decade. But in 1959, Franco implemented the Stabilization Plan, liberalizing Spain's economy dramatically by opening to foreign investment, reducing state control, and encouraging exports. What followed was extraordinary. Between 1959 and 1974, Spain experienced El Milagro Español, the Spanish miracle, the second fastest economic growth in the entire world, surpassed only by Japan's post-war miracle. Industrial production soared. Steel mills proliferated in the Basque Country. Shipbuilding boomed in Galicia. Petrochemical industries emerged along the Mediterranean. The Seat automobile company symbolized Spain's industrial transformation. Tourism exploded. Millions of northern European tourists flocked to Spain's Mediterranean beaches, injecting massive foreign currency into the economy. By Franco's death in 1975, Spain had become the world's ninth largest economy. Per capita income had risen dramatically. A substantial middle class had emerged. Living standards had improved beyond recognition. Paradoxically, this economic miracle created conditions undermining the regime's legitimacy. Economic modernization created an educated, urban middle class, increasingly incompatible with authoritarian politics. International exposure through tourism and media made Spain's political backwardness increasingly apparent and embarrassing. The regime's foundations were slowly eroding, even as economic success created the illusion of stability. Unlike many dictators, Franco made no attempt to create a hereditary dynasty or ensure his regime's perpetuation after his death. His only child was a daughter, and in Franco's traditionalist worldview, women did not rule states. Instead, Franco took calculated steps toward restoring Spain's monarchy. In 1947, the law of succession declared Spain a kingdom with Franco as regent for life. This was ratified by referendum of dubious legitimacy given the authoritarian context. The succession question was complicated by dynastic disputes. The legitimate heir to Alfonso III was his son, Juan, Count of Barcelona, living in Portuguese exile. However, Franco and Juan had difficult relations. Juan was relatively liberal, favoring constitutional monarchy, and had occasionally criticized Franco's regime. Franco's solution was to bypass Juan entirely and prepare Juan's son, Juan Carlos, born in 1938, as his successor. Juan Carlos was brought to Spain in 1948 as a 10-year-old child and educated under Franco's direct oversight. He attended military academy, university, and received extensive training in governance. Franco carefully shaped Juan Carlos as his chosen heir over more than 2 decades. In July 1969, Franco formally designated Juan Carlos as his successor with the title Prince of Spain. Juan Carlos took an oath of loyalty to Franco and the Movimiento's principles. Most observers assumed Juan Carlos would faithfully continue Franco's authoritarian system. They were catastrophically wrong in this assumption. In 1973, Franco resigned as head of government while retaining positions as head of state and military commander, appointing Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco as prime minister. Carrero Blanco was a longtime Franco loyalist who had served since the Civil War, but his tenure was tragically brief. On December 20, 1973, Carrero Blanco was assassinated by ETA in a spectacular attack. As his car passed over a tunnel ETA had excavated beneath a Madrid street, massive explosives detonated, launching his armored vehicle over a 5-story building. He died instantly. By the early 1970s, Franco was visibly declining. Parkinson's disease progressively incapacitated him. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His movements became shuffling and uncertain. His once sharp mind showed clear deterioration. Throughout 1974 and 1975, Franco's health crises multiplied. Power was temporarily transferred to Juan Carlos during several emergencies, allowing the prince to gain governmental experience in demonstrating the succession mechanisms. Functionality. Franco's last public appearance came on October 1, 1975, the anniversary of his 1936 appointment as head of state, when he gave a speech in Madrid. He appeared in full military uniform but was clearly frail, his voice weak, his movements labored. He condemned international criticism following recent executions of political activists and reaffirmed his commitment to defending Spain. 4 weeks later, on October 30th, Franco suffered multiple heart attacks. He was rushed to La Paz Hospital in Madrid and placed on life support. His body, ravaged by Parkinson's, age, and multiple organ failures, was shutting down. Franco lingered for 3 weeks in what many describe as medically prolonged agony. His doctors, reluctant to let the Caudillo die, attempted multiple desperate interventions and surgeries. Franco underwent repeated operations. He received numerous blood transfusions. He was kept alive through artificial means that today would be considered medically futile and ethically questionable. Finally, in the early morning hours of November 20th, 1975, Francisco Franco Bahamonde died at age 82. The official causes were heart attack and septic shock. He had ruled Spain for 36 years, 8 months, and 19 days. Juan Carlos succeeded Franco as King Juan Carlos I on November 22, 1975. Most observers, both in Spain and internationally, expected basic continuity. Juan Carlos had been Franco's personally selected heir, educated within the Francoist system, publicly loyal to the regime for decades. Instead, Juan Carlos moved decisively and surprisingly quickly toward democracy, demonstrating either remarkable long-concealed commitment to democratic values or impressive adaptability to changed circumstances. Within months, Juan Carlos appointed Adolfo Suárez, ironically a former Francoist minister, as prime minister, with an explicit mandate to democratize Spain's political system. Suárez, working closely with Juan Carlos and reformist elements, began systematically dismantling Franco's authoritarian structure from within. In June 1977, just 18 months after Franco's death, Spain held its first genuinely free election since 1936. Multiple parties competed across the political spectrum. The Communist Party, illegal and brutally suppressed for nearly 40 years, was legalized and participated openly. Democratic socialist parties competed freely. Turnout exceeded 78%, demonstrating overwhelming public enthusiasm for democracy. A new democratic constitution was drafted through extensive negotiations involving all major parties. In December 1978, it was approved by referendum with overwhelming 88% support. The constitution established a parliamentary constitutional monarchy, guaranteed comprehensive civil liberties, legalized political parties and trade unions, granted substantial regional autonomy, and separated church and state. The transition faced serious opposition from authoritarian elements. Significant portions of the military and security services preferred Franco's system. The far right violently opposed democracy, but the overwhelming majority of Spaniards, exhausted by dictatorship and eager to join democratic Europe, strongly supported the transition. The most dramatic test came on February 23, 1981, when Civil Guard Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Tejero led an attempted coup, storming the Cortes with 200 armed men and holding the entire parliament hostage. For several tense hours, Spain's democracy hung precariously in balance as military commanders across Spain decided whether to support the coup or remain loyal to constitutional government. King Juan Carlos proved decisive. He appeared on television in military uniform, forcefully denounced the coup, and explicitly ordered all military forces to support constitutional authority and democratic government. His personal intervention proved crucial. Military commanders, recognizing the king's clear position, remained loyal to the constitution. By the following morning, the coup had completely collapsed. The plotters surrendered and were later tried and imprisoned. The failed coup's total failure demonstrated Spanish society's genuine commitment to democracy. Even the military itself, despite pockets of authoritarian nostalgia, was fundamentally unwilling to overthrow democratic institutions. By the mid-1980s, Spain's democratic transition, La Transición, was essentially complete. Felipe González's Socialist Party won the 1982 elections decisively, the first time the left had legitimately held national power since the Republic. In 1986, Spain joined the European Economic Community. Democracy was irreversibly consolidated. La Transición is internationally regarded as one of history's most successful peaceful transitions from dictatorship to democracy. It avoided the violence that marked regime changes in many other countries It successfully integrated former Francoists into democratic politics rather than pursuing wholesale purges that might have destabilized the transition. However, the transition remains controversial within Spain. Critics argue it was excessively conciliatory to Francoists, allowing them to retain wealth, influence, and sometimes positions of authority. The implicit Pacto del Olvido, Pact of Forgetting, essentially agreed not to systematically prosecute Franco-era crimes to avoid reopening wounds and threatening stability. This left many victims without justice or even acknowledgement. Mass graves from the Civil War and White Terror remain throughout Spain, many still unexcavated. Thousands of families still don't know where their relatives are buried. Franco's crimes were never systematically investigated or prosecuted. Many perpetrators lived comfortable retirements, their crimes forgotten or deliberately ignored. These tensions persist in contemporary Spain. The historical memory movement seeks greater acknowledgement of Franco's crimes, exhumation of mass graves, and some form of justice or recognition for victims. Conservatives often argue this unnecessarily reopens old wounds that time has healed and threatens social peace by relitigating the past. The 2019 exhumation of Franco's remains from the Valle de los Caídos and reburial in a family crypt was deeply controversial, symbolizing Spain's continuing struggle to reckon with Franco's legacy. Nearly 50 years after his death, Francisco Franco remains Spain's most controversial and divisive historical figure. His legacy resists simple moral judgment precisely because it encompasses such profound contradictions. His regime was unquestionably responsible for enormous human suffering. The White Terror systematically murdered tens of thousands. Political prisoners endured decades of imprisonment. The Stolen Children program destroyed countless families through institutionalized kidnapping. Regional cultures faced brutal suppression. Women suffered systematic patriarchal oppression. Spain endured 4 decades without political freedom, while Western Europe democratized. Franco's international alignments remain deeply troubling. His collaboration with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, even avoiding formal World War II participation, creates uncomfortable associations. His willingness to allow German bombing of Guernica, his deployment of Spanish volunteers alongside German forces, his admiration for fascist methods, all morally tarnish his historical reputation. Yet, his regime simultaneously presided over Spain's dramatic economic transformation from impoverished agricultural backwardness to become the world's 9th largest economy. The Spanish miracle created unprecedented prosperity for millions, generated a substantial middle class, and modernized infrastructure. Living standards rose beyond anything previously experienced in Spanish history. Perhaps most remarkably, Franco's decision to restore the monarchy and grant Juan Carlos freedom to democratize facilitated Spain's peaceful transition to democracy. Unlike other dictators who attempted perpetuating their regimes, Franco created institutional conditions allowing his system's dismantlement without civil conflict after his death. How should history judge Francisco Franco? He was neither Hitler nor Mussolini. His authoritarian regime, while brutal and repressive, never achieved or even seriously attempted totalitarian control over all aspects of life. He was fundamentally a product of Spain's traumatic early 20th century, shaped by colonial warfare elevated through civil war, and driven by unwavering determination to maintain power and prevent leftist politics from ever again threatening his vision of Spain. His anti-communism was genuine and absolutely central to his worldview. He viewed Spain's left not as legitimate political opponents, but as civilization's existential enemies. Yet he was also remarkably pragmatic when circumstances demanded, as demonstrated by his World War II neutrality and his regime's gradual liberalization. Franco's personal character remains frustratingly elusive. He gave few interviews, wrote no memoir, and revealed little of his inner thoughts. He was reserved, calculating, and emotionally controlled, inspiring loyalty but rarely affection. Perhaps the fairest assessment is acknowledging Franco as a complex historical figure who exploited political chaos to seize power, ruled with brutality that diminished over time, presided over both grave crimes and significant achievements, and ultimately permitted a transition that peacefully dismantled his authoritarian legacy. Spain has successfully become a prosperous democracy, yet Franco's shadow persists. Debates about his memory, his crimes, and how Spain should reckon with this past continue shaping Spanish politics and identity. The Caudillo, nearly 5 decades dead, remains controversially present in Spanish life, a contested memory that refuses to fade quietly into history. Thank you for watching this Today Tribute documentary on Francisco Franco, a man who dominated Spain for a generation and whose complex, troubling legacy continues provoking debate and reflection.